Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation, Imagination and Faithful Practices of Resistance. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Callid Keefe-Perry is Assistant Professor of Contextual Education and Public Theology here at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. A lifelong New Englander, he is a first-generation college graduate whose teaching and research orbit around explorations of imagination, spirituality, and education as sites of individual and social formation. A graduate of the College of the University of Rochester, Callid received his Master of Arts in Teaching from Earlham College Graduate Division of Education, his Master of Divinity from Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School, and his PhD from Boston University School of Theology. Prior to joining us here at the STM, he served as a lecturer in practical theology at Boston University, where he also worked as Assistant Director of Contextual Education. His scholarship engages themes of public and practical theology, critical pedagogy, and theologies of imagination. Before Callid's career in the academy, he was a public school teacher and worked in leadership for several arts-based nonprofits, including the Transformative Language Arts Network and The Space, a community improv theater he co-founded and managed in Rochester, New York. He is an active Quaker minister at Three Rivers Worship Group and Fresh Pond Monthly Meeting. His service within his denomination centers around adult religious education, teaching practices of discernment, and ministerial formation. Callid thinks that it is okay for religious people to laugh a lot, that power cedes nothing without demands, and that creativity is a vital quality of adaptive and effective leadership. We are delighted to have him speak with us tonight on some of the themes emerging from his research on the intersection of theology and the study of the imagination. Welcome, Dr. Keefe-Perry.
Thank you so much, Mick and others. I'm grateful to be here with you this evening. Before getting going, I also want to give thanks to some other folks who are here that are important for me. First is my family here, my wife and daughter, Christina and Nahar, and my brother, Declan. These are all important conversation partners for me. And also my church family is represented this evening. Robert Dove McClellan is here holding me and you all in prayer throughout the evening from Fresh Pond Monthly Meeting, my congregation here. Also, a lot of gratitude, not only to the invitation from Megan, but also students and colleagues here. It's good to see your faces in the room. One of the things I should say to start us off is a recognition that when Megan and I first talked about tonight's lecture, I thought it would double as a book launch for my new book on imagination. However, due to some delays at the publisher, we've missed that mark by 1 month exactly. So I've got copies of my last book on theopoetics here this evening, but my next book, which will be an introduction to theologies of imagination, will be available next month. And if your name is on the registration list for tonight, whether you're here in person or in Zoom, you'll get an email about that later, and it will include a discount code for the ordering of that if you're interested. So make sure you're on the list if you want to hear more about that. So this evening, the title of my talk for you, as Mick said, it has to do with imagination and faithful practices of resistance. And essentially what we're going to do in the next hour or so is walk through each of the words in that title, asking some questions about what those words mean exactly, and how it is they connect to one another. And then I'll do some braiding for you 3 times tonight. First, I will braid practice into imagination. And then second, I'll weave faithful into those first two. And finally, I'll close by seeing what emerges when we pull together the lines of resistance into that chord. Ultimately, this is all about how we can imagine new faithful practices of resistance. Logistically, we'll end with about 20 minutes to chat with each other, and I'll do my best to respond to any questions. It's also worth that noting, to keep you on your toes, there's several points where I'm going to ask for interaction from you. The screen and all of those times will look like this. That's me, that's you. My line will be up there, your line will be down there. Got it?
Yes.
Great. To start, we'll turn to practices. So I want to begin with the question of what a practice is exactly and why a theologian would care about one. And I think that this question is actually best answered in reverse order. So I'm a theologian that cares about practice because I was trained in, and I still work in, the field of practical theology.
What is practical theology?
Great question. Oftentimes, when that phrase is used, people assume that practical refers to a kind of theology that's useful or pragmatic or applicable. That is, practical is the opposite of impractical. And while I think that most practical theologians do hope that our work is useful, that's not usually how we're thinking about exactly what it is that practical means. Instead, the practical in practical theology refers to theologies that are concerned with practice. At a broad level, practical theology usually orients itself towards some particular human activity, and it begins theological reflection only after first getting a good sense of the logistics and the specifics of that practice. So, for example, a practical theologian whose work pertains to the practice of pastoral care is likely to be interested in learning how it is that priests and pastors and ministers care for the spiritual lives of members of their congregations. They will want to learn about how it is that lay people care for one another and how it is that all of those practices of care change over time. Now, these investigations are often done using the tools and methods of social science. So many practical theologians read and produce not just theology and philosophy, but also psychology, education, sociology, and cultural studies. In my case, I also study political science, media studies, and emerging research on imagination and creativity. In any event, paying attention to what is materially the case in the observable present is usually an important building block and a starting point for contemporary practical theologians. In doing so, there's a significant and inherent affirmation of our ability to note and respond to the signs of the time. But this was not always the case. This is Friedrich Schleiermacher. He was a German Reformed theologian from the early 1800s who's often seen as the father of modern practical theology. We find his vision of practical theology in his very creatively titled book from 1811, A Brief Outline of Theology. There, Schleiermacher describes the relationship between practical theology and the other disciplines within theological study, and he divides theology into three distinct fields using the metaphor of a tree. Philosophical theology was the root system of the tree. Historical theology, including biblical studies, was the trunk or the body of the tree, and practical theology was the crown of the tree. Now, far from crown having any reference to royalty here, what Schleiermacher did was frame a model in which practice was essentially the application of healthy theology and rightly learned doctrine. Get that stuff figured out correctly, and then you just had to do it. The crown emerged from the trunk and the trunk from the roots. Now, this is absolutely cutting Schleiermacher some short shrift, but you'll have to get the point. It's all we're going to do tonight. Sorry to Frederick. If practical theology was just about the application done rightly, then the people doing practical theology and application were mostly clergy, who were responsible in turn for guiding, nurturing, and discipling the laity to make sure they got it right as well. In this model, practical theology is kind of a collection of hints, tips, and tricks for the practices of ministry. Start at the bottom, take a one-way street to the top of the practice hill. This kind of thinking persisted for many decades in both Protestant and Catholic seminaries and divinity schools. By the late 20th century, this dynamic was disparagingly referred to as a problem that practical theology had with, quote, the clerical paradigm. Now, there are some places within the academy, even today, that functionally persist with this model. And I think there is a place for collecting, passing on, and learning hints, tips, and tricks for the practices of ministry. But that is not where I come down.
Where do you come down?
Really, really good question. Okay, so why do I study practice? Well, in terms of my own influences and inheritances, I think it is worth naming that I have been profoundly shaped by the work of these folks. Going around the circle, a sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, the educator, Paulo Freire, the liberation theologian, Juan Luis Segundo, and the practical theologians, Don Browning and Courtney Goto. Now, if you have a particular desire to hear any greater details about how those folks have shaped my own understanding, we can talk about it afterwards. But what's important is to name that I've taken a lot from them. And in general, they agree that when physical actions are repeated and felt to be important for a group of people, that's because those actions are connected to some sense of idea and shared meaning. So, for example, Don Browning, that's the guy on the bottom, he argued that practices have theory implicit within them, and that theory suggests practices. He used the term theory-laden to rule out in advance the idea that theory is distinct from practice. This suggests a model that is essentially 3 steps. First, exploration and analysis of this theory-laden practice, then retrieval of a normative theory-laden practice, and 3, creation of a more critically held theory-laden practice. Well, what is this actually? We should take a look at what is, what ought to be, and what could be. The could be, in this sense, is a more self-reflective practice, the result of interaction between the is and the ought of practice and theory. This gets named in bunches of different ways and in different places, but it's often represented by some variation of see, judge, and act. To study a practice is to recognize it, reflect on it, assess it, norm it, do something to change it and or what you think about it, and then rinse and repeat. Note that this is a cycle and not a one-way street. To study a practice is not merely to study repeated actions, but also the values that are embedded in that action. Often the study of practice by theologians is focused on Christian practices like Eucharist, worship, prayer, or religious education. The practice of prayer, for example, in its myriad forms, seems to have within it the concept that God's will, in fact, can be done on earth as it is in heaven. The practice of praying itself surfaces and reinforces this concept, even if latently. Usually, within practical theology, attention is given to Christian practices. However, approaches to broader concerns happen as well, such as the practices of care for the environment, support of the military, use of social media, participation in public education, attendance at Red Sox games, and the ritualized hatred of the Yankees. In all of these instances, however, and those are all real studies, if as a Christian practical theologian is studying them, there's probably an assumption that underlying that practice, there is some coherent and discernible pattern of meaning making that has shared points of contact between Christians who are doing that practice. People engage in practices because of some relationship between those practices and the ways they influence that person's behavior, sense of belonging, and expression of belief. Bound up inside and throughout those practices are connections to community and broader visions that shape how we act and see the rest of our lives as well. Not just when we're engaged in the practice itself. Practices ripple through the waters of meaning in our life, and they mark us in ways that are sometimes deeper than words or theory can easily articulate. We are shaped in body, mind, and spirit, and so we turn to imagination. To get us into imagination, I'm going to start with an experiment of sorts. I have to admit, I don't know in advance how this will turn out, so you're going to have to wish me luck. This is called, what did I say I'm calling it? The two-box experiment. So I'm going to invite you to do two things. That includes you at home, your honor system for you, though. First, I have a box here. There is something in it that you cannot see. If some of you have seen this box before, I guarantee you the thing that is in it now you have never seen before. Now, without saying anything aloud, I want you to guess what's in it. Really guess as best you can. Like, I really mean this. Thoroughly guess, if you will, what is in this box. Okay? Has everyone completed the guessing thoroughly? Good. First thing done, that was it. You're halfway there. You guessed what is in the box. Now, the second thing, there's also a thing in this box. You also have not seen this thing. Now, without saying anything aloud, I want you to imagine what is in this box. Really imagine, thoroughly imagine what is in this box. Has everyone completed their imagining? Great. So now here's the test. By show of hands, how many people feel like the results of imagining and guessing were somehow different in any way, shape, or form? Right? Not everyone, but some. And then the people who raised their hands because they saw other people raise their hands. But there's a few at least. And to the extent that there is some experienced difference, I think that's because guessing can be done in such a way that it only hits on linguistic or cognitive dimensions of experience, whereas imagining opens up the door for more sensorial experiences. Imagining something is an affective activity that gets at a sense of the possible. Imagination captures a qualitative dimension that is not necessarily present in merely language-based responses or rational belief. For example, when I asked you to guess what was in the box, you might have thought a toy. And then you would have done as I asked. You guessed. However, when I asked you to imagine what's in the box, part of that request entails a mental construction of what the toy might be. Is it a top? A ball? Is it a puzzle? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How heavy is it? What did it smell like? Imagination taps into sense experience and memory to bring to mind qualities that are not present, so as to consider what might be the case. And for those of you who cannot handle the tension anymore, do you want to know what was in the box?
Yes.
Too bad. Let's say I never open this box, and you head home tonight, or you click out of your browser window, and this entire time you are left without any closure as to what was going on there. Chances are there are some of you who would periodically remember that you don't know what's in the box. Not knowing what some theology professor at BC had in a small box isn't likely to keep you awake at night. But something about unknowing and imagining coming together can persist past the moment in which it began. Sometimes the impact of our impressions and imagination can last long beyond the moment of our first imagining, long beyond even who first imagined it. When my father was a child, his family traveled to Italy one time, visiting his great aunt, my great-grandmother's sister, who was still living there near Piacenza. That's up in the north of Milan. Decades later, when I was a child, and my father shared recollections of his experience with me, the things that stuck out to him from his experience that he realized were how young the U.S. was, how small Italian cars were, and how many damn dirty pigeons were everywhere. Exhibit A. Now, for some reason, this stuck with him, and consequently, it stuck with me. Later, when I lived in Italy, the presence of pigeons there was elevated for me. My experience of Italy was more pigeony than others because of this. Now, it is highly unlikely that pigeons were magically attracted to me for some reason that I know of. But it is the case that I was primed for a Piacenza pigeon presence and was more sensitive to them than others as a result. This is a small story about a family, but what I think we can consider is what this effect looks like when it is scaled up. What happens when what is being imagined isn't just what's in a small box or what Piacenza might be like, but something broader? What if what we are imagining is what the weather of the future will be like? What immigrants are like? What if we're trying to imagine what the church might become or what God is? For all of these questions, we may have a personal sense of what might be the case for them, but the fact is that even personal imagining draws on a shared set of sociocultural images. We usually make sense of our personal experience by linking them to some stories, symbols, and media that has been shared from others and from which others also draw when they imagine. The stuff with which our imagination works is shared stuff. The material of imagination is shaped not only by personal will and by inspiration, but by exposure and experience as well. How others have imagined society shapes how we imagine ourselves. We make society as we are made by society. Now, an individual's imagination has some tools and tropes and hopes that are shared with other people. And these shared imaginative instruments form a kind of interior toolkit of sorts. And these tools can be used for interpretation and construction. They can be used to build various sets and scenery. And when groups of people together use similar sets of tools to build sets that stay standing for a while, sociologists and some theologians call these sets imaginaries or imagined worlds. Used this way, an imaginary world is decidedly not a stand-in for a pretend world or a make-believe. The world envisioned through creative imagination is a collective opening into what might be. A social imaginary is a kind of collective and ambiguous connect the dots game without the numbers. It's a social picture-finding exercise of articulating understandings of the world which are grounded in the lived experience of individuals and then shared with others. This socially shared agreement of the figure in the dots is then combined with ongoing input from other individuals and other societies, the results of which support, maintain, or disrupt ideas about what it is we think we're all seeing. For example, the connection of sky dots, seen as a ladle and called the Big Dipper, is the same set of stars that is sometimes in parts of Ireland called the Plough. And zooming out some, those same stars can be seen as part of Ursa Major, the bear. Likewise, for the First Nations Gwich'in people, this same grouping is just the tail of the much larger figure of Yadi, the tailed man, who walks across the sky from east to west every night. Same stars, different stories. Stars and texts are imagined and named differently by different bodies and different cultures whose histories make it harder or easier to see certain images. How we see and name is in flux, influenced by what we have already seen and sensed, by what names we have heard, by what names we've been called. It is easier for some folks to think that the world is always getting better than others. It was easier to imagine that science would eventually provide all the answers to everything before the bombing of Hiroshima. It is easier to imagine there are plenty of opportunities in the world when those in power look like you, and it is easy to imagine that the world is hard to change. Now, these social imaginaries are not permanent and they are not certain. But insofar as an imaginary is a network of shared stories, symbols, and significances that some folks feel is cohesive and actively articulate as related, they do have some staying power and social momentum. The concept of an imaginary does not just refer to the set of symbols and stories that the group feels is coherent. It includes that web of images, to be sure, and it includes how people feel about them and relate to them. Imaginaries are imaginaries and not just ideas or guesses, because they begin to be carried in shared and inherited generations of images, stories, legends, and hopes that collectively lead to shared practices and dreams. The philosopher Kathleen Lennon has a really beautiful line here. By means of these images, the emotional contours of the subject's world are revealed. They are the way in which we not only think, but also feel our way around. So, now on to braiding number 1, practice and imagination.
Why does imagination matter for religion?
I believe that practices, while perhaps theory-laden, are also the sites where social imaginaries are stuck into the soil of society. Practices are the place where worldviews are made manifest. Practices are patterns of behavior that have tucked inside them the seeds of an imagined vision for the possible future. Now, people may have rational and articulable reasons why they do the things they ascribe important meaning to. But beside and beneath these rational articulations, there are also emotional, aesthetic, and imaginative dimensions as well. Now, this matters for practical theologians like me who are thinking about how to effectively study practice, but I also think it has bearing on all of us who care about religious education, spiritual formation, and the flourishing of a faith that engages with the dynamics of a pluralistic and diverse world. Let me give you an example. The religious education scholar Patrick Manning recently published a book called Converting the Imagination, Teaching to Recover Jesus' Vision for a Fullness of Life. In it, Patrick says this: more than simply transmitting a static body of teachings and sacred texts, religious communities must invite transformation in the very way people make meaning of faith and life. They must instill habits of meaning-making that both draw upon the deep meanings of the Christian tradition and meet the mental demands of living in the world of the 21st century. So, what is a static body of teachings and sacred texts? That's the assumption that knowledge of those things is enough. That having right knowledge is like having an amulet or charm, and that's sufficient. No, says Manning and me, knowing what prayer means or what the significance of Eucharist is ultimately insufficient for a living faith. Passing on the practices of faith must not be just about the actions and the doctrinal reasons, but also the ways in which they point towards meaning, the experience of doing them and the communities they weave us into, how we imagine the world and God in it, the ways we feel when we name the stars. We need to provide people with opportunities and encouragement to practice meaning-making and world-building with their practices. Otherwise, the practices can just become actions, and actions alone do not carry in them a sense of the possible in the same way. The Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, in God in Search of Man, explains that when a Jewish person performs a ritual act without proper intention, it's problematic. He says, a moral deed unwittingly done may be relevant to the world because of the aid it renders unto others. Yet, a deed without devotion, for all its effects on the lives of others, will leave the life of the doer unaffected. The true goal for man, humanity, is to be what she does. So in Hebrew, performing a mitzvah without proper kavanah is inadequate, because while it might have a positive effect on the world, it leaves the doer of the mitzvah unchanged. Or as it's often said, prayer without kavanah is like a body without a soul. Remember, practices are patterns of behavior that have tucked inside of them the seeds of an imagined vision for the possible future. It's an intention. People may have rational and articulable reasons why they do the things they do, but beneath and beside these articulations, there are emotional, aesthetic, and imaginative dimensions as well. And I think we would benefit by turning our attention to these dimensions. Here's a very different example. Some months ago, my brother told me to read this book, Don't Even Think About It, by George Marshall. Now, in this text, Marshall explores the cultural and psychological underpinnings of why it's so hard for society to properly grapple with the realities of global climate change and environmental transformation. And Marshall has a very clear claim. Our brains are geared to look for certain tags, certain signs that tell us whether things are dangerous to us and we need to pay attention to them, or whether we can safely ignore them and push them aside. The things that we pay immediate attention to are things which are here and now, things where there's a certainty of imminent threat, especially those that are caused by an identifiable enemy with the intention to cause harm. And the problem is, climate change has none of these qualities. Climate change appears to be, in the future, uncertain and distant in both time and place. So while our adrenaline might start pumping when we hear a twig unexpectedly snap in the woods during a walk, we don't even blink when we see the data about 416 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the air, even if that's certainly more dangerous. See, knowledge of danger is insufficient because our built-in warning systems aren't up to the task of processing data and outputting the need to be concerned. We are relational and sensorial creatures, we clay-footed humans. We need this data concretized, shared in story, rooted in practice, and done in community for it to have any sway. And this is precisely the kind of thing we're supposed to be good at as people of faith. This is exactly where the church could be engaging. We, perhaps better than any other social institution in the history of humanity, have a very long-standing history with helping people learn about and internalize stories whose endings are not immediate or obvious. Changes in communities and society require changes in how it is that we imagine the world is now and how it might yet be. In fact, I think that utilizing imagination more mindfully can help us to engage with contemporary realities in a far more significant way. Imagination is a vital part of faithfulness, I think. But to say more about that, I first want to say a little more about what it is that faith is in the first place. So we'll take a look at this word faith. In Hebrews 11:1, we get one of the classic Christian articulations of faith. What is faith?
The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen.
So says the New Revised Standard Edition. Right. In this spirit, faithfulness is cultivated in the encouragement of both hope and conviction. We are to be a faithful people whose inward aspirations are yoked to possibility and the promise of transformation. I think, though, that this is insufficient to describe what it is that faithfulness means. Hope in what? Convicted of what? How do we maintain such assurance? To more fully address this, I think we need to wrestle some with the tensions present between continuity and change. When I think about a faith community or a tradition in any way, I think about the ways in which it has been both persistent and porous. That is, what has it held on to over the years, and what has it let go, and what has it let in? It's a question of fit. On one side of a continuum, there's a kind of traditionalism, or the maintenance of tradition as doing something because it's always been done. On this extreme, traditional religious practices are passed on in a rote kind of way. They're done, as it were, as bodies without souls. Innovation and adaptability are viewed as enemies or obstacles to faithfulness, with the only true way being replication of the past. On the other extreme, there's a discontent with the past and inherited patterns, systems, and power structures. Here, on that far end, there's a rejection of tradition with the often unspoken assumption that all tradition is traditionalism and ought to be left behind. Continuity and traditional values are viewed as enemies or obstacles to faithfulness, with the best way to proceed being framed as something that must be new. Now, it must be acknowledged that both of these streams are pretty outlandish. But they do point to tendencies that can emerge and the challenges that they result in. And the further folks are to either side, the more likely they are to claim that those they disagree with are on the far opposite edge. The Catholic theologian Peter Fan has written about this exact tension in an insightful and absolutely gorgeous way. He says, memory anchors the theologian in the ocean of history and tradition, the church's and one's own. But the stability and security it affords is impermanent and illusory. Remembering is not reproducing reality exact as it happened, but recreating it imaginatively. It is remembering disparate fragments of the past together and reforming them into a new pattern under the pressure of present experiences, with a view to shaping a possible future. Like a pair of wings, memory and imagination carry the theologian aloft in the work of linking past and future, east and west, earth and heaven. I take my own position from Fan as well, with influence from the religious education scholar Mary Elizabeth Moore. That's her. Hi, Mary Elizabeth. Moore talks about the importance of an active process of traditioning in religious education. She suggests that there's two foundations for those committed to traditioning, the community and the individual. These are the two foundations. The community has the responsibility to interpret and transform itself, lest it slip into irrelevance. As an interpreting body, it explores the past, the present, and the future of a tradition in view of its knowledge of the world and the church, as well as relationships with other communities, peoples, and bodies of knowledge. It's because the community is a transforming one that it has continuity. Without change, it first ceases to be vibrant and then ceases to be at all. But change for change's sake is just as damning as traditionalism. Change must be oriented towards the promise of the kingdom of God, or some sense of liberation and justice. At the individual level, a person is also always in process, internally linked to the world, other people, and to God. The person both shapes and is shaped by community. As such, traditioning education emphasizes the importance of knowledge as what has come before for the sake of interpretation and transformation of the present. Knowledge of the past and the present ought to be held in dialogue with hopes for the future. And all of this, what has been, what is, and what may yet be, is to be the content of religious education. Moore wants those who inherit the faith tradition to be able to not only pass on the practices and stories that came before, but also be able to use them to interpret their own experiences and guide them in their own changes as they seek to be responsive to God's call and the needs of the church and the world. So now on to braiding number 2. What is faithful imaginative practice? Here's what I say. Faithful imaginative practice is a repeated action within which is embedded a community sense of what is possible. It honors the practices and understandings of the past, affirming that which is life-giving and recognizing the power and importance of tradition. And it's also attentive to the need to throw open the windows and let the fresh air of the Spirit blow through, recognizing that sometimes new words and images will be needed to reach across present gaps and gulfs. That's a ad hoc pull from Vatican II for folks who are interested. Now, on November 10th, 2015, Pope Francis gave voice to something very similar to this in a powerful way during a speech in Florence. It was in Italian, but this is the English. Christian doctrine is not a closed system, incapable of raising questions, doubts, inquiries, but is living, is able to unsettle, is able to enliven. The reform of the church is semper reformanda, always reforming. She is not exhausted in the countless plans to change her structures. It instead means being implanted and rooted in Christ, allowing herself to be led by the Spirit. Thus, everything will be possible with genius and creativity. The Church of Italy lets herself be carried away by his powerful and thus at times restless breath. May she be a free church, open to the challenges of the present, never on the defensive out of fear of losing something. For those of us that are religious leaders, both clergy and lay, I think an emphasis on faithful imaginative practice yields 2 very practical related questions that both point towards area in which future exploration is warranted. And I think these are actually things you can take home and use. 1, What are the practices we already have, both ones in contemporary use and those that we have in our history, that can be carried forward and reinterpreted to more directly engage present concerns and challenges? And two, what traditional commitments and teachings, that is, what faithful hopes and convictions, do we value that would benefit from a new practice to carry them along? So let me give you some examples here. In terms of carrying forward long-standing practices and interpreting them to address the present, we can look at Pope Francis's Laudato Si. There, he drew on long-established theological themes and social teachings and showed how they were connected to ecological concerns in new ways. Is that text rooted in doctrines of creation and theological anthropology that have roots in texts that are centuries and millennia old? Yes. And in that text, Francis showed how these long-valued categories have a particular poignancy in the present. His prayer for the environment, for example, is tied to an encouragement for Catholics to turn their attention to social analysis, technology, global policy, and justice at the family dining room table. These new dimensions are actually there in long-held practice. In terms of carrying forward long-standing commitments and developing new practices to address the present, I think about my own Quaker communities. Compelled by a commitment to hospitality and welcome, COVID-19 required us to rethink how it was we would worship. In the days before a vaccine, access to Zoom was not only convenient, but something we felt called to do for the sake of those in our number likely to be particularly vulnerable to the virus. However, as time went on, we found that there were people visiting us through Zoom who likely would have never come to worship with us in person. As a result, we have since discerned that having a hybrid worship is a practice we are permanently committed to. We don't intend to go back to the way it was. We now have a new faithful way of doing things that would have been hard to imagine before, but has now become regular and routine. And it now carries our hope for radical welcome. What are the practices we already have that are ready for faithful reinterpretation? And what traditional commitments would benefit from a new practice to carry them along? Okay, so now we've covered imagination and faithful practice. That leaves just resistance. Before we get there, though, I want to allow you some time to digest. So I'm going to say, give yourself a minute to let some things settle quietly. Reflect, ruminate, twiddle your fingers, stretch. Then turn to a neighbor or two, introduce yourself, and give yourself some time to listen to each other. I have a prompt up here that might be useful, but you can talk about whatever you like. Again, we'll do a minute for you solo, and then you can gather your thoughts before turning to your neighbors. So here's my suggestion for the prompt. Is there anything that's exciting or compelling to you about what we've looked at so far? If so, why do you think it's compelling to you? Okay, so home stretch. You all ready for resistance? Recently, the Baptist theologian Willie James Jennings was invited to spend some time with us here at the School of Theology and Ministry. He spent some time with faculty, students, and staff. And as part of his work with us, one of the things he shared was an encouragement to ask ourselves as faculty not only what we want to make sure that students know and can do, but also make sure that we are thinking about what we want them to be able to resist as well. How do we lead and teach in ways such that those who work with us and learn from us and grow with us know how to grow personally and how to resist and dismantle larger systems of domination and sin? And ever since I have been thinking of resistance, I'm reminded of James Cone's work in The Spirituals and the Blues, where he articulates that the blues are often fueled, at least in part, by struggle and resistance. As Cone puts it, singing the blues is a way of celebrating survival. It's a song that says, we know we have survived, that we have not been destroyed. That kind of black joy is a complex construct and encompasses pain and exultation. Giving greater attention to the realities of loss can open into power that calls us beyond the present into a more just future. Rather than just ignoring the pains of the present, what happens when greater attention is paid to naming them and performing them so folks no longer feel ashamed for bearing the scorch marks of empire's brand? In her Dream Weaver's Prayer, the poet and theologian Rose J. Percy gets it just right. Wholeness, she says, is a dream we weave, strong enough for those carrying the load to rest in their hopes. Where I've settled is that there's resistance through content and resistance through form. In some ways, resistance through content is the easier of the two. Why is it easier? Well, to be clear, it isn't easy. It's just easier. But it is easier because it's a question of what rather than how. For example, if we accept the truth of global climate change and the human actions that are part of it, then we can teach about recycling, use more eco-friendly products, change the lights, and vote for politicians that believe in science. And if you happen to be a professor of theology, you can decide to include work from eco-theologians. You can assign perhaps Pierre Desjardins, Jürgen Moltmann, Karen Baker-Fletcher, or Tink Tinker. You can teach the material, make sure that the what is present, and resist it through content. But what happens when an energy audit reveals that the state of Massachusetts alone annually consumes the same amount of energy as Haiti, Ethiopia, Senegal, Myanmar, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cambodia, and Cuba combined? That's a fact. Do we just keep teaching content and allow our context to remain unchallenged? What does that do to the reception of the material? The recognition that teaching resistance via content alone in a context whose form is dissonant with the message is a hard truth to face. To some degree, this is an issue of integrity, privilege, and hypocrisy, and that I will not deny. But it is also, I think, even worse than that. Resistance with content is easier than resistance with form because it is sometimes easier to change what we do than how we do it. The fact is that containers can shape content. Sometimes this is intentional. If you have never been served a Moscow Mule, it is a cocktail that has lime in it, vodka, which you can assume is already in the cup, and ginger beer. And you get it in a copper mug. Now, that's because this cocktail was originally invented as a marketing ploy to use up a crate of ginger beer and vodka that wouldn't sell because it was 1940. It was served in copper because there was a Russian immigrant who lived on the block and had a lot of copper cups she was trying to get rid of in LA. True story. The citrus in the lime of the drink interacts with the copper and the vodka to oxidize it and give it a slightly different smell and taste. Now, there's no way that was known in 1941 when Jack Morgan invented the drink at his bar on the Sunset Strip. But today, the drink is still served because the container itself is part of the drink. Intentional and tasty. Sometimes, though, the container shaping the content is not intentional. For years, the company Nalgene made plastic bottles, first for laboratory purposes, and then later for consumer purposes like hiking, or so I am told. They were popular because they can take a fall and still be fine. However, in 2003, some scientific research began to emerge suggesting that the bisphenol A, that is the BPA in BPA plastics, not only made it stronger and more resilient, but it also contributed to disrupting hormone levels and estrogen receptors. After retailers such as REI began to complain and threaten to pull the bottles off the shelves in 2007, Nalgene began to produce them using BPA-free plastics, which they just simply hadn't done before. Unintentional, but still toxic until changed. And then there are times when the situation is both intentional and toxic. We knew about it and did nothing about it. Throughout much of the Roman Empire's history, for example, lead-2 acetate, commonly called the sugar of lead, was used to sweeten and preserve foods. Historical documentation notes that the citizen of Rome enjoyed the slightly sweetened taste of water taken from lead cups and lead-gilded pitchers. Symptoms, for those of you who are interested, of lead poisoning include developmental delays, abdominal pain, neurological changes, and irritability. At very high levels, it can be fatal. And while not as detailed as contemporary medical knowledge, I'm not making that mistake, we know that Pedanius Disaccharидus wrote about the poisonous of lead in the 1st century, as did Pliny the Elder in 77 CE. But it tastes so good. What does the empire do to sweeten its drinks? How often do we sip from those cups? We can be opposed to consumerism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. We can say loudly and proudly that we are so opposed, but actually trying to embody the changes that reflect that content commitment is much harder. And embodiment, my friends, is what we are after. A bodily practice that resists in both form and function, container and content, giving some sense of what way is yet possible. And so we've arrived at the end, the final braiding. What are imaginative practices of faithful resistance? Here's what I say. What's an imagined practice of faithful resistance? They are the sites of meaning-making that find their home in our flesh. Our bodies are made into a living epistle to those that come after us. They honor understandings of the past and yet find themselves unfrozen, able to affirm places of growth from the 1st century to the 21st. And they lead with a thirst, a need for justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And so they seem to find the words that need to be spoken, and they speak them, or not, as the situation requires, content to pray down the fires, adding also the power of motion, a silent prayer of lament in the broad ocean, stretching the limits of our longing. A litany of protests and the needed right naming of conquest that have left land and souls marked and scarred, burned and charred, and so they challenge by content, form, and vision, pointing to possible sites of decision in both their pitch and timbre, honey-hued futures captured in amber, released and brought to life, sometimes. And sometimes new words and images are needed to reach across present gulfs and gaps, to press against code switching that saps energy and will as others get to speak in their first tongue. And we learn so young how it is to speak right. But what happens when what counts as faithful changes? What freedoms are found in broader ranges? What voices rise and find seats at the table? What tables are flipped? What feared are lost? What fears are stilled? What streets will be filled with those marching for another world? And finally, justice for all. See, here in the academy, we ought to ask what it will take for us for rigor to be more. What can the academy finally welcome through its door? What might change? What are we training people for? What are we training them against, even if unintentioned? Whose names are heard, whose names unmentioned? What are we dreaming for? Where is the shore we're headed toward? And aloft on whose wings? So too in the church, Christ calling from the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, living pages of history and possible future folded into one sacred heart, divine origami. Suffering servant with tears pronounced in the language of home, salvation, yes, and resistance to Rome. Remember, he replied that his kingdom is not of this world, spirit curled in flesh, as he prayed for us, embodied trust, though we know not what we do, and so we seek more and through conviction. A new way of life, it challenges prediction, to search out new ways of being so that love can finally find a home in our breast, that new ways might bring some measure of rest, speaking new words to open hearts so that they may see a future not yet, but that might yet be. In memory of thorn and thistle, we make our bodies into living epistle. Move to the thrum of God's insistence. We must imagine new faithful ways of resistance. So that's what I have to say about that. Let's start with one online, because I haven't been able to see their beautiful faces. Do we have an online question? Get those rolling. If there's one in the chat, we can roll with it. Otherwise, we could do run the room. We have one in the room. Question, comment, concern, complaint, kudos in the back.
Great job. I was going to ask, so you ended the piece with, a spoken word poem. Like, where do you see practices like that being specifically pertinent to undoing some of the negative practices you spoke about?
Yeah, I mean, part of the question there has to be, the educator-minded me wants to think about assessment, right? So, for example, there was a period in time early on in my doctoral studies where I was doing work on a Christian podcast. And at that point in time, I could pick up my phone, talk into it, hit upload, and within an hour, 20,000 people would hear me. And I had to quit so I could write a dissertation that 5 people read. One counts, one doesn't. So the question is to begin to think in assessment, what counts and what doesn't. So that's one way to think about it. Does it matter or not, and matter to who, and matter for what? I think it's a question of assessment and evaluation. Thanks. Others? How did you feel in your body? How's it going? How's your neck doing?
All right. Thanks, Callid, for your work. I'm just curious, you were talking about how containers can influence whatever liquid is in it. So given that the STM in and of itself is its own container, can you comment on how it's influencing its students, faculty, staff, et cetera?
My boss is in the room. You know that, right? Yeah, look, you remember that part where I was talking about the kind of ridiculousness of the two sides of those extremes, right? We understand that models are meant to model. They're not the thing, right? We don't eat the menu. We use the menu to order the food. Part of what happens in an institution like this is that people are shaped to its needs and its expectations. And the reality is that the modern theological educational institution was created by Schleiermacher for King Wilhelm in the early 1800s. Same course listings as it was in early Germany. We haven't changed. The question is, what does that do to people's souls and spirits? And is it worth it? Now, I am very rarely an absolutist. So what I want to ask is, what do we get out of it? Let's presume that even in things that are problematic, there's some measure of merit. So what do we get out of it? At what cost? And the reality is, I think, we begin to know more and more, costs are not the same for all folk. This place might sound a lot like how I sound anyway, but what if it doesn't? What if English isn't my first language? I, for example, know of some colleagues in some places where they've begun at the undergraduate level to recognize competency-based education. So people whose first language isn't English, but now speak English, get credit for a language because they learned it. And then people are upset. We're like, but that's not fair. I don't get language credit for speaking English. I was like, yeah, that's because you just speak English. So what we want to figure out, I think, is asking questions about what is this place for? And we know that if a thing is just for itself, it's a fallen thing, right? So we need to begin to say, okay, well, we know it's not just for itself, but it's for what? And we can look at our mission statements, our strategic plans, the intentions of the faculty and staff and students who come here, and then ask ourselves the real question, is it doing that? And then at what cost? I was recently doing some research about mental health and higher education, and the rates of mental health for depression and anxiety among graduate students in the humanities is 7 times that of the average population. 700% greater mental health challenges with folks who are in higher education. Now, that's not just theological education, that's humanities in general. but my hunch is we'd see a similar spike in our numbers. And my question is, why? What are the costs? And I think we ought to be factoring that into our equations. Just like for a long time, we didn't do the work of externalities when we were looking about factories polluting, and we just looked at the cost of the widgets. We're making knowledge here. At what cost and what's going in the river.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat.
We'll do one chat and then here to
Yeah.
Tom.
So the question in the chat says, how can we utilize art more in the academy and on the streets as imaginings of new worlds?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the case is I'm the wrong person to ask, in the sense that artists are always ahead of scholars, always. I'll say that absolutely. So some of us who are artists and scholars kind of dabble in between worlds, but I have to spend so much time keeping up with some of the academic work, for reasons see above, that I'm not always going to be on the front edge of that. What I will say, though, is that I think sometimes what we need to be looking at is the medium of production. So, for example, in student classes, let's just say, when the end project is a paper, what that shows is a certain kind of learning and a certain kind of model and a certain kind of evaluation of what it is that we intend to do here. And oftentimes, hopefully, that paper is informational and formative to the student, and the faculty person reads it and does whatever they're going to do with it, and that's it. But if the same amount of energy was spent doing something that faced outward, then all of that human energy would continue to have greater life, right? So what would it mean if part of what we were doing in classes engaged the public? What would it mean for people to be producing art as a measure of assessment in the room, for us to find ways to evaluate that such that it had ripples beyond the classroom, right? I think about all of the human waste, the energy that goes into final projects that only go into a drawer, right? What if instead each one of those was recorded and put on YouTube? If there was a book produced that was sold, if there were fly shoes painted and then sold at auction, the money of which went to a charity. No one's buying my grad student papers, let's guarantee you that, right? So what would it mean to begin to reconceive of what the culmination of learning is? I think that's a question of pedagogy and evaluation. We'll go to Tom, and then in the back, we have one up here. We'll wait for the mic so they can hear in the internet.
Thank you so much, Callid. Just a beautiful, moving presentation.
Thanks.
And your closing poem was a coup de grace, and just spectacular. I'm just wondering about, and I deeply appreciate your affirmation of imagination, and in many ways we've neglected the imagination, at least of late, in philosophy, theology, pedagogy, what have you. I'm wondering about the role of memory, that when we begin to look for images, we typically dip into the well of the memory. And Augustine, as you know, was adamant that reason, memory, and imagination were to function together as the three persons of the Blessed Trinity, with this deeper unity. Just where do you see memory featuring, and especially in the epistemology that you're proposing?
Exactly. Yeah, so here I borrow highly from Van's work as well as Gordon Kaufman, which is to say memory is essential to the task of imagining, right? So part of my commitment or my understanding of imagination is that imagination is not culled from the void, right? The shared stuff of imagination is precisely that, shared. Well, as soon as we talk about shared, to some degree we're talking about memory. But we must understand that memory and remembering is already an imaginative act, right? Unless we're dealing with like some kind of very specific physical science sense of memory, like I know that this tree is from 30,000 years ago because the carbon atoms in it like vibrate this much, and you're using memory in that sense, which is not normally what remembering means, then other than that stuff, memory is always involving imagination because it's an act of interpretation. So the question is, do we recognize that kind of there are facts and there is history, but there's also the story that we tell of that history? So I think it is important, on the one hand, to not kind of lean into a kind of imagination that imagines that it has no mooring, right? But on the other hand, we also need to recognize that the mooring is itself an inheritance of an imagination of a culture. That these things are cumulative and sedimentary, and that part of our work is about trying to figure out what might need to be re-narrated because there were voices that were suppressed. So, for example, the work of Dr. Emily Towns has been huge here to recognize that within dominant histories there have been suppressed voices that are there in the margins if you know to look. So memory is always about remembering and recovery or repetition of the dominant narrative. In the back, hey.
Hi, Callid.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you again. And ditto, really good job. What I felt while you were speaking was that you were bringing to us permission to use our imaginations, permission to be imaginative. So I was thinking about whether, when it comes to the practices of the church, whether you could conceive the administration of the sacraments in any way as also giving permission to use the imagination, not just as, we who administer the sacraments use our imaginations in explaining them, but can the sacrament be that for the person receiving it? And I ask the question, obviously, as a minister and on behalf of those who are going to be administering the sacraments in this school.
Yeah. So two things there. The first is a particular thing about my theory of imagination, which is there's always imagination at play. So sometimes what you'll hear is people talk about a lack of imagination, and I say there is no such thing. My students who are here, you can plug your ears, you've heard me say this 1,000 times. When we say there's a lack of imagination, what I think we're really saying is that's the imagination of the dominant system of power. If we allow imagination to be just what's not new, then we allow the dominant imaginary to be what is real. And that is dangerous and deadly. So what we talk about is the dominant imagination and the resistant imagination. Not no imagination and some imagination. We'll talk about liberatory or sanctified imagination in resistance to dominant systems of subjugation and power. That's one thing. Two, yes, absolutely. I think to some degree, and I'm borrowing here from Jean-Luc Marion, who's a phenomenologist who talks about the saturation of being. And in places like, for example, in sacraments, there's such a fullness of being, givenness. In Paul Ricoeur's language, there's a surplus of meaning. It's overflowing. And so these sites, these thin places or sacramental spaces are places which are so rich with possibility that encountering them is the encountering of some other world, right? The divine. That's why we refer to them sacramentally. So what I think is being in touch with the living power of sacramental moments, whether they're the sacraments or sacramentality, is precisely the opportunity to invite in the revisioning of the world. If it just becomes rote, then I think we've slipped away from the thing as a powerful practice in touch with imagination and simply slipping into that form of traditionalism.
I'm interested in the idea from the beginning of your lecture about how the world shapes our imagination, but then how our imagination can shape our world. And my question is basically, what are the limits of that? What are the limits of the imagination, and how do we know what is realistic to imagine and what's not realistic? Yeah. So like, when you ask somebody to imagine what's in the box, if somebody imagines that there's like a forest inside or a hippogriff, what are the limits?
How do you know there isn't a forest inside? So yeah, this is right on point. So I do think there are, so for example, what we brushed into there, I think, is the reality of some physical limitations, right? There can't be, for example, 50 acres of forest in that box unless I mean that in a funny, weird metaphorical way. Or maybe I could have a deed to a plot of land that is 50 acres, but it's not 50 acres because that can't fit in that box. So I do think it's really important to recognize the realities of the physical sciences and the limitations within the world. So kind of early on in my career in scholarship, some people have said, like, I'm anti-reason. I'm not anti-reason. Like that, it's just the fact that I want to recognize that rationality is not monovocal. There are rationalities. I'm not anti-rationality. I'm pro-rationalities, plural, which some people will hear as being anti-rational, and to them, boo-hiss. But the point is, the science of physics and shapes and boxes is one of the rationalities that I'm all for. I can't fit a forest in there unless we mean this in a kind of metaphorical, linguistically playful way in which we've shifted the language game. So I think it's important to recognize the constraints within which communication can take place. That being said, the way that I think about the work of pushing back or not is actually, interestingly, drawn very significantly, I think, especially given I know some of your interests, on the work of people doing work in ecology. Because what they're trying to figure out, and Marshall there, but also a number of others, is how can we convincingly talk about this thing, the facts of which are already known, but no one believes? And so in a lot of that literature, there's discussion of fit, right? So you figure out to what extent a community can handle certain kinds of conversations. And you say, well, if we start talking about parts per million, they can't handle it. So we have to say, well, that's not useful. That doesn't mean it's not real or we shouldn't keep doing that science. But we have to figure out what the limits of the communicative edges of the community are, learn those places, move to that edge, and begin to use it to push it, and then use it to push it. So it's really the study of communication. You seem unsatisfied with that. No. Oh, okay. Okay. You shouldn't be. There's more to do, so hope that's useful, at least a little. Others, we've probably got time for one or two. Reflections are fine as well. Ooh, my daughter. Hey, daughter.
You mentioned how the literal and real world impacts imagination. In what light do you see that? Is it bad? How, like, it limits in some way?
Yeah, so, I mean, what I think, Nahar, is that I would say I'm not negative or positive really about it. It's important to recognize the constraints that the world brings. So just like we were talking about, it isn't bad that that box can't fit a forest in it. I mean, it would be dope if I had a box that could fit a forest in it, but it's not bad that it can't, right? Similarly, humans live and die. That isn't bad, it just is. So I can't fly when I jump off a building. We need to be aware of the kind of the physical constraints of the world. And if I was going to say there's something bad about that, it comes about when we pretend that those physical constraints aren't real. So tonight, one of the themes was ecological in reality, and that's one of the places where we pretend as if a thing that is not. We imagine that what is going to happen will not. That's the problem. And, as a poet, part of the reason I'm okay with that is because constraint and recognizing constraint sometimes allows for a greater kind of creativity. For those of us that are in religious service, oftentimes people will say, but don't you know about all the things you're missing out on because of X, Y, and Z? And I want to say it's not missing out if what you're choosing to do is live your life a certain way. So the problem is when you pretend you can do anything with no consequence, or that we are not on the edge of the end of the Anthropocene beginning, right? That's the problem when we try to imagine that the physical constraints are not there. When we do recognize them, we can then figure out what to do with what is, so that we can actually answer the question of what might be. Maybe one from the internet?
Yep, we have one from the chat. It says, how might Quaker stillness nurture the flowering of imagination and the practice of radical response to help heal the world?
My friends are in the chat. Awesome. How would the practice of Quaker stillness? Okay, so this is, I'm really greatly gratitude for the way that question is phrased. So oftentimes folks, including friends ourselves, will kind of identify one of our our most kind of common practices as silence. And silence is a corollary to stillness, but stillness is the thing. And partly that's the case because early on in the tradition, we would gather in the middle of a marketplace because we didn't have meeting houses yet. So there'd be hustle and bustle and fish selling and, well, I don't know, whatever else happens in marketplaces in the south of England, probably not fish over there, whatever. They're selling stuff and it's loud and raucous. And in the middle, there's groups of people who are moving into a deep sense of prayer from which anyone may begin to pray or preach. And so I think that that sense of stillness, of entering into the world as it is and being present and listening for what God is asking us to do in the midst of that, it's kind of a radical orientation. In the Catholic tradition, folks who are radically engaged with listening for signs of the times and discernment, we have a lot of resonances, which is part of the reason it feels like home to me here. The move is towards intense communal discernment of what God is asking from the world. So I think that only happens when you're still. You need not be quiet. Sometimes quietness emerges from the stillness. We can do without the quiet. We cannot do without the stillness. Maybe a last one.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if this is a question or a loving expression of frustration. Because the title, Imagination and the Faithful Practice of Resistance, is what I'm really hungering for, looking for. And I'd like to push back a little bit on the statement that was offered by, I guess, George Marshall, I think, in that book about climate, about there not being an identifiable enemy with an intention to cause us harm. Because I think that there are identifiable enemies that do intend to cause us harm. And that some of the ways that I've felt most faithful have been when I've taken arrests to confront those powers. Yeah. So I haven't been in academia for a long time, and so it's unfamiliar, like the first part of your talk was really unfamiliar to me and challenging, and I'm going to look for it when it's up in a month, because I think there's a lot, there's a lot to learn. Yeah. But I'm hungering for more, for the applicability of your concepts, out there on the streets, because we don't have a lot of time, as you have said.
So I think this is a great example. So what the data and the science there says is, what we're talking about is hormonal and neurochemical things, like learning about the enemies there doesn't set off the danger, like a tiger. Like it just doesn't do the thing, the chemical adrenaline flood, like it just doesn't. So there's a hardwiring or a biophysical lack of able to engage. And the practices of active resistance and arrest, I think, is exactly kind of like this limit situation that was talked about here. What you're doing is moving to the edge and saying, let my body become the thing that lets you know there's a problem. Because I have seen that this thing is a danger and is coming. And if you're unable or unwilling or disinclined or resistant to accepting this reality, I will bring this reality home to my body to show you what is the case. So you've come to the edge as far as people can listen because they can't hear this, and you've been able to hear it, and you're trying to live into it so that other people can see it. In the Quaker tradition, Bill Tabor used to talk about the prophet's task is to find the law, to name the law, to live into the law, and bring it to the people of God. That's also, to some degree, what Walter Brueggemann says the role of the prophetic imagination is. Creatively criticize and energize in that space so that people can hear the thing that they need to hear. So I think it's precisely that kind of thing which is what you're doing, and what I would name that's happening in those moments of arrest or resistance or protest is that you're taking this vision of the world that is clear to you but not yet to everyone, and you're finding a way for it to come home in your body which other people will see.
But there's not always impact even with that. That's the frustration.
No, that's right. But what I'm pretty convinced of is just talking about it more is insufficient. We have to do it through shared practices and in community, or there ain't no hope. Which is part of the reason we need each other to do this work.